Lillian Sunday liked her uniform. It was a light blue dress with white trim that made her feel like she belonged to a different time. Every night at Sunday's diner, she would pin her name tag neatly to her chest and tie her white apron in a perfect bow. To Lillian, that uniform was like a shield. As long as she wore it, she was just a waitress in a safe, quiet world. She spent her nights filling salt shakers and pouring coffee for people who just wanted a warm place to sit. The clock on the wall ticked slowly toward 3 a.m. outside. The rain was coming down hard, blurring the streetlights into fuzzy yellow spots. Lillian's aunt, Lillian Brooks, had owned this diner for years, and Lillian worked the graveyard shift to help keep it running. It was a simple life, and that was exactly how Lillian liked it. She didn't want trouble. She didn't want excitement. She just wanted to make sure the floors were clean and the coffee was hot. Then, the bell above the door rang. It wasn't the normal sound of a customer coming in. It was followed by a heavy, stumbling thud. Lillian looked up and froze. A man stood by the entrance, swaying on his feet. He wasn't wearing a flannel shirt like the local truckers. He wore a sharp black suit jacket over a white dress shirt, but the clothes were ruined. They were torn and soaked with rain and something much darker. The man was Kong Min-jae, though Lillian didn't know his name yet. He looked like he had stepped out of a movie about powerful, dangerous people. His face was cut, and he was holding his side as he moved toward a red leather booth. He collapsed into the seat, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. Even though he was hurt, he didn't look scared. He looked focused. He pulled out a phone with a bloody hand and started typing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lillian stood still behind the counter. Her heart started to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew she should pick up the phone and call for help. She knew that men who wore expensive suits and had fresh wounds usually brought trouble with them. In her neighborhood, you learned early that if you saw something dangerous, you looked the other way. But she couldn't look away. She saw the way his hand shook as he gripped his phone. She saw the dark red puddle starting to form on the floor she had just mopped. Lillian grabbed a clean white cloth and walked toward him. Her legs felt heavy, and her breath felt tight in her throat. "Sir?" she whispered. Her voice sounded small in the empty diner. He didn't look up at first. He just kept pressing buttons on his phone, his face pale under the neon lights. Lillian reached out and gently pressed the cloth against the wound on his side. He flinched, and for a second, his intense eyes met hers. They were dark and full of a cold authority that made her want to run, but underneath the steel, she saw a flicker of real pain. Lillian looked down at her hands. The white cloth was already soaked through. Then she saw her apron. A bright red stain was spreading across the pristine white fabric. Her light blue uniform, the one that made her feel safe and invisible, was ruined. A wave of fear washed over her. If she helped this man, she was stepping out of her quiet life and into his dangerous one. She thought about her aunt and the diner. She thought about what happened to people who got caught in the middle of Mafia wars. Her mind told her to stay out of it, to be safe, and to let the world's cruelty happen somewhere else. But as she looked at the blood on her apron, something inside her shifted. She realized that the stain was already there. She couldn't go back to being the girl who just poured coffee. She could either let this man die on the floor of her aunt's diner, or she could be brave enough to help him. Lillian gripped the blood-stained cloth tighter. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't move away. She had stumbled into a nightmare. But she made a choice right then. She wasn't going to run. The rain was still drumming against the roof when Lillian heard the sound of a car engine slowing down outside. Panic flared in her chest. She looked at the man in the booth, then at the front window. She knew that if whoever was in that car saw him, the quiet life she loved would be over forever. "We have to move," Lillian said, her voice shaking but firm. Min-jae looked up from his phone. His face was even paler now, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He didn't argue. He knew his time was running out. Lillian hooked his arm over her shoulder. He was much heavier than he looked, and the smell of expensive cologne mixed with the metallic scent of blood made her dizzy. Together, they stumbled toward the back of the diner, past the heavy silver coffee urns and through the swinging kitchen doors. Every step seemed to take an hour. She led him to a small wooden door near the walk-in fridge. It opened to the cellar, a place filled with sacks of flour, extra napkins, and old boxes of canned peaches. It was cold and smelled like dust and damp earth, but it was hidden. She helped him sit down on a pile of clean burlap sacks. He leaned his head back against the stone wall, his eyes closing for a moment. Lillian quickly grabbed a first aid kit from the shelf and a bucket of warm water. She worked fast, cleaning the cuts on his face and checking the deep wound in his side. Her hands were still trembling, but the focus of the work helped her stay calm. Min-jae watched her through narrowed eyes. He looked at her simple light blue uniform, now stained with his blood, and the way she carefully tended to him like he was just another customer who had fallen down. "Why aren't you calling the police?" he asked. His voice was raspy and low, like grinding stones. "Or the hospital. You have to know that helping me is a mistake." Lillian didn't look up from the bandage she was wrapping around his waist. "My aunt always says that a person in need is a person in need. Besides, the police around here don't always help people like us. I figured you had your reasons for not wanting to be found." Min-jae let out a dry, painful laugh that turned into a cough. He reached out with his good hand and gripped her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make her stop. He stared at her, searching her face for any sign of a hidden plan or greed. "Do you even know who I am?" he demanded. He was used to people trembling at his name or trying to win his favor because of his power. Lillian pulled her arm back gently and stood up. She looked at him, really looked at him, not as a mafia boss or a dangerous man, but as a person who was hurting in her cellar. "No," she said simply. "I don't know you at all. Are you someone famous?" Min-jae froze. He was stunned. For the first time in his adult life, someone was looking at him without seeing the dragon or the kingpin of the city. To this girl in the blue uniform, he was just a stranger bleeding on her supplies. "I'm just a man who had a very bad night," he finally said, his voice softer than before. Lillian nodded. "Well, that man needs to stay quiet. I have to go back upstairs and mop up the mess before anyone else comes in." As she turned to leave, Min-jae realized that he owed a debt he couldn't pay with money. This girl had no idea that she was hiding a wolf in her basement, yet she had chosen to be kind anyway. It was a kind of bravery he didn't understand, but for the first time, he felt like he wanted to deserve it. Lillian was back in the main room of the diner, scrubbing the red leather booth with a damp rag. The smell of bleach was strong, stinging her nose, but in her mind, she could still smell the heavy, metallic scent of blood. Every time she looked down at her light blue uniform, the red stain on her white apron felt like a giant neon sign. It felt as if everyone who walked by would know exactly what she was hiding in the cellar. She tried to fold the fabric over to hide the spot, her fingers trembling as she tucked the cloth under her waistband. The bell above the door chimed again. This time, the sound wasn't heavy or desperate. It was a slow, sharp ring that made Lillian's skin crawl. A man stepped inside, shaking the rain off a dark, expensive coat. He didn't stumble. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, like a wolf walking into a fenced yard. This was Diego Morales. He had a sharp jawline and eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like a person who was used to taking whatever he wanted. Lillian hurried behind the counter, trying to keep her breathing steady. She grabbed a glass pot of coffee, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. Diego didn't sit in a booth. He walked straight to the counter and sat on a tall stool, right across from where Lillian stood. "Rough night, sweetheart?" Diego asked. His voice was smooth and calm, but it had an edge to it that made Lillian feel like she was standing on thin ice. "Just the rain, sir," Lillian replied. She reached for a clean ceramic mug. Her hands were shaking so much that the cup rattled against the saucer. She poured the coffee, focusing as hard as she could on not spilling a single drop. She didn't want to give him any reason to look at her more closely. Diego didn't touch the coffee. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "I'm looking for a friend," he said, his eyes scanning the empty diner. "Well, not a friend, exactly. More like a stray dog. He's hurt, and I have a feeling he might have crawled in here looking for a warm place to hide from the storm." Lillian felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She thought of Min-jae lying in the dark cellar just a few feet below them. She thought of the blood she had just cleaned up and the secret she was now carrying. If Diego found out she was lying, she knew the diner wouldn't be safe anymore. Her Aunt Lillian's dream would be gone in a second. "It's been a very quiet night," Lillian said, her voice small but steady. "Nobody has come in except for a few truckers heading north about an hour ago. It's just been me and the coffee since then." Diego stared at her for a long time. The silence in the diner felt heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the rain hitting the glass. He reached out and tapped his fingers on the counter in a slow, rhythmic beat. His gaze dropped to her waist, where she was still trying to hide the stain on her apron. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. "That's a shame," Diego finally said. He stood up and pulled a $20 bill from his pocket, tossing it onto the counter. It was way too much money for a cup of coffee he hadn't even tasted. "Because if that dog shows up, you shouldn't try to feed it. Stray dogs are dangerous, and they usually bring trouble home with them." He turned and walked back out into the rain, the bell ringing one last time as he left. Lillian leaned against the counter, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She watched his car pull away, realized that the wolf was still circling, and knew that the night was only getting started. Lillian barely had time to catch her breath before the bell rang again. This time, the person walking in didn't hide in a dark coat or move like a hunter. It was Detective Marcus Reed. He was a tall man with a tired face and a badge clipped to his belt. Lillian had seen him in the diner many times before. He usually came in for a slice of apple pie and a friendly chat about the neighborhood. Normally, seeing him made Lillian feel safe, but tonight, his presence felt like a heavy shadow. "Early morning, Lillian," the detective said as he took off his hat. He looked exhausted, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. He didn't sit down. Instead, he walked along the counter, his eyes scanning the floor and the booths. "I suppose it's been a long night for everyone." Lillian tried to keep her hands busy by wiping down the counter for the 100th time. "It's been quiet, detective." "Just the rain and the radio," she lied, her voice cracking slightly. She felt like a fraud. She was a good person who never broke the rules. Yet here she was, lying to a police officer while a criminal hid beneath her feet. Detective Reed stopped near the booth where Minjae had first collapsed. He leaned down, looking closely at the floor. Lillian's heart stopped. She had scrubbed that spot with bleach, but she wondered if she had missed a single drop of red that could give everything away. "We're looking for someone, Lillian," Reed said, turning back to her. His voice was serious now. "A man named Kong Minjae. He's a big player in some very bad business. There was a shootout a few blocks away. We found his car, but he's gone. If he's out there, he's dangerous, and he's probably looking for a place to go to ground." Lillian looked at the detective. For a second, she wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to point to the cellar door and let the law take over. But then she remembered the stories her aunt told her. She remembered how some detectives worked for men like Diego Morales, and how the law didn't always protect people in their part of town. If she turned Minjae over to a compromised system, she might be signing his death warrant, and her own. "I haven't seen anyone like that," Lillian said. She forced herself to look the detective in the eye. "Is everything okay? You look worried." Reed sighed and rubbed his face. "I'm worried because the streets are getting meaner. Lillian, if you see him, call me. Don't try to be a hero. People like him bring a storm with them that you don't want to be caught in." He turned to leave, but he paused at the door, glancing back at Lillian's apron. She had tried to hide the stain, but the edge of the red mark was still visible. Her breath hitched. The detective stared at it for a long, silent moment. Lillian waited for him to ask about it, to demand to see the cellar, or to pull out his handcuffs. Instead, Reed just nodded slowly. "Take care of yourself, kid, and maybe get a new apron. That one looks like it's seen enough for one night." As the door closed behind him, Lillian realized the detective knew she was hiding something, but for some reason, he had chosen to walk away. She was now trapped between a mafia boss in her basement and a detective who was watching her every move. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only thing standing between a man and his grave. Lillian waited until the sound of the detective's car faded completely into the rain before she moved. Her heart was still thumping against her ribs, but she had to check on the man in the cellar. She grabbed a fresh bottle of water and a clean towel, then slipped through the kitchen and down the wooden stairs. The air in the basement felt colder than before, and the dim yellow light made the shadows look long and shaky. When she reached the bottom, she found Minjae in a bad state. He wasn't sitting up anymore. He was slumped against the sacks of flour, his face flushed with a bright, angry heat. His eyes were half open, but they didn't seem to see Lillian. He was shivering so hard that his teeth rattled, and he was mumbling words in a language Lillian didn't understand. He was having a fever dream. "Mr. Minjae," Lillian whispered, kneeling beside him. She pressed the cool towel to his forehead. He flinched and grabbed her wrist, but his grip was weak and clumsy. "Diego, why?" He groaned in English, his voice thick with pain. "I gave you everything. We were brothers. He began to toss his head back and forth, reliving a nightmare. He spoke about a meeting at the docks and a hand he had reached out in trust, only to have it met with a gun. He talked about how Diego Morales had turned his own men against him just to take a bigger slice of the city. To Minjae, the betrayal hurt more than the bullet in his side. Lillian stayed with him, wiping the sweat from his brow and talking in a soft, calm voice. She told him about the diner, about the smell of her aunt's apple pie, and about how the rain always made the streetlights look like diamonds. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she wanted to pull him away from the dark memories of his world. After a while, the shivering stopped. Minjae's eyes cleared, and he looked at Lillian with a strange expression. The cold, scary look was gone. Instead, he looked confused, like he was seeing something impossible. "You're still here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I told you I'd help," Lillian replied. She helped him take a sip of water. Minjae stared at her light blue uniform. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the red stain on her apron. "The man who was just upstairs. Morales. He is a monster. He kills people just for looking at him wrong. And the detective, he is not a man to be trifled with. You lied to both of them for me." Lillian looked down at her hands. "I just did what I thought was right." Minjae shook his head slowly. "In my world, nobody does what is right. They do what is profitable. They do what makes them powerful. I have spent my whole life surrounded by men who would sell their own mothers for a bag of gold. But you are a girl in a diner who has everything to lose. And you risked it all for a stranger who can do nothing for you right now." He looked at her with a kind of wonder that made Lillian blush. "I have never seen bravery like yours. Lillian Sunday. I have seen men face armies without blinking, but they were doing it for pride. You are doing this because you have a good heart. That is much more dangerous." "I'm not brave," Lillian said, looking away. "I was terrified the whole time." "That is exactly what bravery is," Minjae said. He leaned his head back, looking exhausted but more peaceful. "Being terrified, but standing your ground anyway. You are a small girl in a blue dress, but tonight, you are the strongest person I have ever met." Lillian felt a lump in her throat. For a moment, the cellar didn't feel like a scary hiding place. It felt like somewhere she had made a real difference. But the moment didn't last long. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked, and Lillian knew the night was far from over. Lillian had just made it back to the kitchen when the sound of breaking glass echoed through the diner. Her heart felt like it was going to jump out of her chest. She didn't have to look to know that Diego Morales' men had come back. They weren't knocking this time. The front door was kicked open, and the bell rang wildly, sounding like an alarm. "Check the booths. Check the back." A loud, mean voice shouted. Lillian heard the heavy thud of boots on the checkerboard floor. They were moving fast, flipping over tables and smashing plates. Lillian knew she only had seconds. If she stayed in the kitchen, they would find her and the cellar door. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes landing on the heavy metal cart she used to move crates of milk. She pushed it with all her strength, wedging it against the swinging kitchen doors. It wouldn't stop them forever, but it would give her a moment to think. She ran back down the cellar stairs, her breath coming in quick gasps. Minjae was awake, his hand already reaching for the small weapon he had hidden in his jacket. He looked at Lillian, and even though he was weak, his eyes were sharp and ready. "They're here," Lillian whispered. Minjae tried to stand up, but he groaned and fell back against the flour sacks. "You have to leave, Lillian. Go out the delivery hatch. They only want me." "No," Lillian said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I know this diner better than they do. Stay low." Above them, the kitchen doors rattled as the men pushed against the cart. Lillian remembered the old layout of the building. Before it was a diner, it had been a warehouse with secret paths. She moved to the back of the cellar and pulled away a stack of empty crates, revealing a narrow crawl space that led to the service vents. "Can you crawl?" she asked. Minjae nodded, his face tight with pain. She helped him slide into the dark space. Just then, the cart upstairs gave way with a loud crash. Lillian heard footsteps right above her head. She knew she couldn't hide in the crawl space with him. Someone had to lead them away. She grabbed a heavy jar of pickles from a shelf and threw it toward the far corner of the cellar, where it shattered against the stone wall. "Down here," a voice yelled from the top of the stairs. Lillian didn't hide. She climbed halfway up the stairs and stood in the dim light. Two men appeared at the top. They looked like giants in their dark leather jackets, their faces twisted into mean smiles. "Where is he, girl?" One of them asked, stepping toward her. Lillian pointed toward the back of the kitchen, near the large trash bins. He went out the back. He climbed through the window when he heard you. The men looked at each other, then back at Lillian. For a second, she thought they wouldn't believe her. She gripped her apron, the red stain still visible under the kitchen lights. One of the men noticed it. "You've got blood on you," he growled, reaching for her arm. "I cut myself on the broken glass you made." Lillian shouted back, pretending to be angry to hide how scared she was. "You're making a mess of my aunt's diner. Get out." The men hesitated. They were killers, but they weren't used to a young woman in a blue uniform shouting at them. They heard a car horn honk outside, a signal from their boss. "Forget her," the other man said. "If he went out the back, we can catch him in the alley." They turned and ran toward the back exit. Lillian slumped against the stairs, her heart racing so fast she felt dizzy. She had used the layout of the kitchen and her own bravery to trick them. She waited until she heard their car tires screech away before she went back to the crawl space. She reached in and touched Min-jae's hand. "They're gone," she whispered. Min-jae pulled himself out, looking at her with a mix of shock and respect. "You lied to them again. You stood right in front of them." "I told you," Lillian said, trying to smile even though her hands were shaking. "I'm the one who works the graveyard shift. I know how to handle trouble." Min-jae didn't say anything, but the way he looked at her showed that he knew she was much more than just a waitress. She was his shield, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly safe. The sun was just starting to peek over the buildings, turning the gray rain clouds into a soft, pale orange. The storm had finally passed, leaving the streets of the neighborhood quiet and wet. Lillian sat on a stool behind the counter, her head resting on her hands. She had spent the last few hours drifting in and out of sleep, jumping at every little sound. Every time a car drove past or a floorboard creaked. She thought Morales's men were coming back to finish what they started. She knew she had to check on Min-jae one last time before her Aunt Lillian arrived to open the diner for the breakfast rush. Lillian stood up, her muscles feeling stiff and sore. Her light blue uniform was wrinkled, and the red stain on her apron had turned a dark, rusty brown. She felt like she had aged 10 years in a single night. Lillian walked back into the kitchen and opened the cellar door. "Mr. Min-jae," she called out softly. "The sun is up. It's safe now." There was no answer. The cellar was silent. Lillian hurried down the wooden stairs, her heart starting to race again. She reached the bottom and looked toward the pile of flour sacks where she had left him. The space was empty. The first aid kit was closed neatly on the shelf, and the bucket of water had been emptied. The narrow crawlspace was open, but the man who had occupied it was gone. For a moment, Lillian felt a wave of fear. Had someone taken him while she was asleep? Had the detective come back? She looked around the room wildly, searching for any sign of a struggle. But the cellar was cleaner than it had been before. Even the bloody towels were gone. Then she saw it. Lying on top of a clean sack of flour was a single white cloth napkin from the diner. It was the same kind she put out every night for her customers. Lillian picked it up. It was heavy in her hand. Wrapped inside the napkin was a thick stack of $100 bills. More money than Lillian had ever seen in her entire life. It was enough to pay the diner's rent for years, enough to fix the roof, and enough to make sure her aunt never had to worry about bills again. But it wasn't the money that made Lillian's breath hitch. It was the words written on the fabric. Min-jae had used a dark, permanent marker to write on the napkin. His handwriting was sharp and strong, despite his injuries. It said only one thing: "I do not forget my debts. You are under my protection now. This is a promise." Lillian traced the letters with her finger. Underneath the words was a small smudge of red, a fingerprint of his blood left behind as he wrote. He had disappeared into the shadows of the city as quietly as he had arrived, leaving no trace that he had ever been there except for this napkin and the money. She climbed back up the stairs and stood in the middle of the empty diner. The morning light was filling the room, making the chrome napkin holders and the glass sugar jars sparkle. For the first time in her life, the diner didn't feel small or hidden. It felt like a fortress. Lillian took off her stained apron and folded it carefully. She tucked the promise napkin into her pocket, feeling the weight of it against her leg. She knew that her life wouldn't go back to exactly how it was before. The dragon was out there somewhere, recovering and planning his next move. And even though she was just a waitress in a blue uniform, she knew she wasn't alone in the dark anymore. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and the bell rang with a cheerful chime. Her Aunt Lillian walked in, smelling like lavender and fresh air. "Good morning, sugar," her aunt said, looking at the messy tables. "My goodness, it looks like you had a busy night. Are you okay?" Lillian looked at her aunt and smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "I'm okay, Auntie. It was just a long night. But I think everything is going to be just fine from now on." 6 months had passed since the night of the great storm, and Sunday's diner looked better than it ever had. With the money Minjae had left behind, Lillian and her aunt had repainted the walls a bright, cheerful cream color. The neon sign outside no longer flickered. It glowed with a steady, warm pink light that welcomed everyone on the street. The broken booths were fixed, and there was even a new espresso machine that made the whole place smell like rich chocolate and roasted beans. But the biggest change wasn't inside the diner. It was outside on the streets. For years, the neighborhood had been a place where people walked quickly and kept their heads down. Gangs like Diego Morales's had made everyone feel afraid. But shortly after that rainy night, things began to shift. One by one, the people who used to cause trouble simply disappeared. The wolf who had sat at Lillian's counter was never seen again, and word on the street was that a new, invisible power had moved in, one that didn't tolerate bullies or thieves. Lillian still worked the graveyard shift, but she didn't feel the same cold knot of fear in her stomach anymore. She wore a brand new light blue uniform, crisp and clean, with a fresh white apron that was free of any stains. She was still the same girl who liked filling salt shakers and pouring coffee, but there was a new strength in her eyes. She knew that her small act of kindness had changed the world around her. One Tuesday night, around 3 a.m., the diner was quiet. Lillian was wiping down the counter when she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It was a beautiful car, sleek and shiny, reflecting the streetlights like a dark mirror. It sat there for a long time, its engine idling quietly. Lillian didn't call the police, and she didn't hide. She simply watched. The window of the car rolled down just an inch, and for a brief second, she caught a glimpse of a man's hand resting on the door. He was wearing a sharp black suit sleeve, and on his wrist was a watch that sparkled under the neon lights. He didn't get out, and he didn't make a sound. He was just there, watching over the diner like a silent guardian. A few minutes later, the delivery bell at the back door rang. Lillian walked to the kitchen and found a small, elegant box sitting on the prep table. There was no name on it, only a small drawing of a dragon curled around a coffee cup. Inside the box was a plate of the finest chocolate-covered strawberries Lillian had ever seen, along with a small gold pin in the shape of a shield. Lillian took the pin and fastened it to the underside of her collar, right over her heart. She looked toward the cellar door and smiled. She knew that Minjae was out there, using his power to make sure her world stayed safe. He wasn't a stray dog or a monster to her. He was a man who had kept his word. She walked back to the front of the diner and poured a fresh cup of coffee. She placed it on the counter, right at the spot where the wounded man had first collapsed. Even though the seat was empty, she liked to think he knew it was there for him. Lillian Sunday had started that rainy night as a waitress who wanted to be invisible, but she ended it as the heart of the neighborhood. She had learned that you don't need a badge or a gun to be a hero. Sometimes, all it takes is a clean cloth, a warm place to hide, and the courage to help someone when the rest of the world is looking the other way. As the sun began to rise over the city, Lillian knew that the darkness could never truly win as long as there was a light left on in the window.